In a quiet corner of West Virginia, where rolling hills stretch like whispered prayers and fog clings to the valleys each morning, there stands a wooden chapel with peeling white paint and a rusted bell tower. People called it Our Lady of Grace, a place where weddings once rang with joy, babies were baptized, and even the hardest hearts knelt in prayer. By 2023, however, it had become a shadow of its former self. Services echoed in empty pews. Candles burned not out of devotion, but out of habit. Dust settled on hymnals, thickening with each passing week, as if the echoes of past faith whispered, "We've been forgotten." The man who still stood behind the altar, Father Wei Chen, had seen war. As a former Marine, he had served in the deserts of the Middle East. But it was here, in the Appalachian Mountains, that he chose to serve in silence, preaching in a chapel with no choir, no congregation, only time. He was a man of routine. Every Sunday, rain or shine, he unlocked the creaky chapel doors at 6 a.m., laid out the same white linen on the altar, lit the same incense, and stood beneath the same hand-carved statue of Mary, imported from Italy in 1905. She had stood there for over a century, high above the altar in an iron niche, arms outstretched, gaze eternal. Everything changed on September 8th, the feast of the Nativity of Mary. The morning began like most others, foggy, damp, with a quiet so thick it seemed to swallow sound. Father Wei moved through the chapel like a ghost, whispering prayers, touching each pew as if to recall the souls who once sat there. He thought it would be another lonely Sunday. But then she walked in. A little girl, no more than 10, wearing a white dress, barefoot, with a rosary around her neck. Her steps made no sound. She didn't speak. She simply walked to the third row, sat perfectly still, and stared at the altar, at the statue. Father Wei had never seen her before, not in church, not in town, nowhere. There was something in her presence, both calming and unsettling, as if she belonged to another world yet wasn't out of place. He nodded to her. She didn't nod back. And so the Mass began. A priest, a girl, and silence. What happened next would become the turning point for the entire town of Coldwater Ridge. It would bring people back not only to the chapel but to something deeper, something forgotten, faith. It all started with a fall that broke nothing, a statue that fell from over 15 feet yet remained whole, and a girl, Mei Lin, who touched it and then vanished. What happened in that small American town defied scientific explanation, only understood through faith. Coldwater Ridge wasn't always quiet. Decades ago, horse hooves clattered down its dirt roads, and church bells rang loud enough to rouse even the sleepiest farmers. Children in starched shirts raced up the chapel steps, and old men in dusty boots tipped their hats as they passed the statue of Mary out front. Back then, Our Lady of Grace was more than a building, it was the heart of the town. Perched atop a gentle slope, its steeple visible from every porch and pasture, the oak pews inside gleamed with polish. On Sundays, families crowded in, shoulder to shoulder, smelling of pine soap and fresh biscuits. The air carried the scent of candle wax, incense, and coffee drifting from the side hall after Mass. The statue of Mary, carved in Italy and placed with reverence by the first settlers, stood proudly above the altar. Locals whispered she had saved the mine from collapse in the 1930s. Others swore she protected the children during the measles outbreak. Whether true or not, the belief was enough. But time dims even the brightest flames. As decades passed, the mine closed. Factory jobs vanished. Families packed their memories and left, some to Ohio, others as far as Texas. Those who stayed grew older, their knees ached, their backs bent, their eyes dimmed. The chapel that once pulsed with life hollowed out. The white paint on its wooden siding peeled like old bark. The bell tower groaned in strong winds. Inside, the pews cracked, no longer polished. Dust-coated hymnals untouched for years. Father Wei kept preaching. Every Sunday, every holy day, rain or shine, even when his voice echoed off stone to empty seats, he lit the altar candles and never skipped a line in the liturgy. He read scripture with the same reverence he once gave to a full congregation, even when only 3 parishioners came, or none. He sang psalms in a voice barely audible, as if hoping the walls remembered the words. But the deepest silence came not from the chapel, but from the town. People still believed, perhaps, but not with the fire of old. Faith in Coldwater Ridge had become a quiet tradition, more memory than movement. Children played football on Sundays instead of attending. Massachusetts elders lit candles at home rather than climb the hill to church. And the statue of Mary watched it all from her iron perch, eyes cast downward, arms open, as if waiting for someone to return. She waited through storms, winters, and years of unanswered prayers. So did Father Wei. Until that September morning, when a strange girl, Mei Lin, walked in from the mist, when the impossible happened, and when Our Lady of Grace, long forgotten, breathed again. September 8th dawned like any other sleepy Sunday in Coldwater Ridge, gray skies, heavy dew, fog so thick the chapel seemed to float above the earth. It was the feast of the Nativity of Mary, a date most in town had forgotten, but not Father Way. For him, it was sacred, worth preparing for, even if no one came. At 5:30 a.m., he opened the chapel, the wooden door groaning as if reluctant to face another empty pew. Inside, the air was cold and still. He lit the altar candles, wiped dust from the chalice, and laid out his worn white vestments, reserved for Marian feasts. He brewed an extra pot of coffee in the parish hall, just in case. But deep down, he expected nothing. He expected silence. That was until the door creaked open again, and Mei Lin stepped inside. No wind stirred, no footsteps echoed, yet someone had entered. A girl, no older than 10, walked slowly down the center aisle. She wore a simple white dress, her dark hair falling gently across her shoulders. Around her neck hung a wooden rosary, handmade, each bead worn smooth as if prayed 1,000 times. She spoke no words, looked neither left nor right, showed no confusion or shyness. She moved with a stillness found only in saints or shadows. She stopped precisely at the third pew, center aisle, and sat. Not a creak from the old wood, not a sound from her bare feet, just a quiet, clear presence. Father Wei Chen froze behind the altar. He knew every child in the region, he had baptized most, taught them catechism, offered them candies from the same jar after Massachusetts. But this girl, Mei Lin, wasn't from here. No child would climb that hill alone at this hour, unless something else had brought her. He cleared his throat, speaking softly. "Good morning, little one," he said, his voice trembling more than he intended. Mei Lin turned her eyes to him, dark, gentle, bottomless, and smiled faintly. She didn't answer, didn't blink, just smiled as if she knew her purpose there. A strange feeling stirred in Father Wei's chest, peace, but not comfort, awe, but not fear. He began the liturgy, his voice low, hands steady, but his heart uncertain. She watched him the entire time, not with a child's boredom or a visitor's curiosity, but with something ancient, as if she had been here before, waiting for this moment longer than he had. As Father Wei whispered the sacred words, "This is my body," something shifted. A warm wind, soft but undeniable, swept through the stone chapel from the altar outward. The candle flames trembled. The windows didn't rattle, but the walls seemed to breathe. Then came a sound, a dull, hollow thud, like a tree falling in a distant forest. Heads turned, though only 2 were present. Above them, the statue of Mary, steadfast in its iron cradle for over a century, dislodged, tipped forward, and fell. It plummeted over 15 feet, yet it didn't shatter, didn't chip. Instead, it landed gently, as if placed there, as if unseen hands had caught it midair and set it down with care. Father Wei stared, mouth open, knees weak. Mei Lin stood, walked slowly to the statue, knelt beside it, and placed one small hand softly on Mary's feet. Before the priest could speak, she was gone. Vanished. No footsteps, no door, no trace, just the memory of a white dress and a statue on the ground, whole, intact, gazing upward as if it had descended, not fallen. For a full minute, Father Wei stood frozen, eyes locked on the statue, hands trembling above the altar. The sacred host lay untouched. The half-spoken prayer lingered in the silence. No words came next. No ritual could follow what had just happened. The girl, the statue, the wind, none of it made sense, yet it felt more real than anything he'd known in years. He stepped down from the altar and approached the fallen statue. There she was, Our Lady of Grace, lying sideways on the chapel floor, arms outstretched, offering peace. Her eyes gazed slightly upward, her expression serene. No cracks, no chips, no scratches, not even a dent in the hardwood floor. She had fallen from over 15 feet, yet it looked as though invisible hands had laid her down gently. Father Wei fell to his knees, not in panic or awe, but in surrender. For years, he had preached to empty pews. Now, in the presence of a miracle and a mystery, all he could do was kneel and weep. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Minutes passed. The incense burned out. The candles flickered low. He didn't move until the heavy wooden door creaked again. It was Mrs. Li Mei, 73, a retired librarian who hadn't set foot in the church since her husband's funeral a decade ago. Her steps were slow, cautious, but when she saw the priest kneeling beside the fallen statue, she stopped in the doorway. "Father," she asked, her voice fragile, "what happened?" "She fell," he whispered, eyes still on the statue, but she didn't break. Mrs. Li crossed herself and stepped back. She asked no more, only stared, wide-eyed, her lips moving in silent prayer. Word spread faster than wildfire in a dry summer. Some heard it by phone. Others felt a shift and came. A few, strangely, said they dreamed of a girl in white the night before. One farmer swore his dog howled that morning and wouldn't stop until he walked it up the hill to the church. By sunset, over a dozen townsfolk stood at the chapel's door. Some brought flowers. Others brought candles. Some brought only their confusion and buried faith. Father Way hadn't touched the statue. He couldn't. He draped a clean white altar cloth over her, like a blanket. Around her, the first bouquet arrived, daisies from a young mother, then sunflowers from a widower, then lilies, then roses. Each flower carried something sacred, grief, gratitude, prayers too personal to speak aloud. That night, the chapel stayed open. No one spoke. People sat, knelt, cried, and stared. The next day, they kept coming. By Tuesday, cars lined the gravel road down the hill. By Wednesday, local news reporters parked outside. By Thursday, people arrived from the next county over. Some came out of curiosity, but most came with something stirring inside them, unnamed. There was no sermon, no announcement. But the miracle had gone public, and Coldwater Ridge, a town that had nearly forgotten how to pray, was waking up again. Father Waitchen never called it a miracle. He never claimed the girl was an angel or a ghost. He didn't need to. Something had happened, undeniable and profound. At the heart of it all lay the statue, still on the ground, whole, gazing upward. The space where Mei Lin had knelt in the third pew remained empty, yet more than one person later said they felt a warmth there, inexplicable and lingering. And just like that, the old chapel, once silent, was breathing again. It began quietly, no thunder, no lightning, no angelic choirs. A young woman, barely in her 20s, walked up the chapel hill with a baby wrapped tightly in a flannel blanket. Her name was Hannah Kim, from Mill Creek Hollow, nearly 4 miles away. She wasn't Catholic, hadn't been to church in years, but for 3 nights, she'd had the same dream, a girl in white standing beneath a glowing sky, saying, "Bring your son to the lady. She will care for him." Hannah didn't understand it. All she knew was that her baby, June, hadn't cried in days. His fever wouldn't break, and the local doctor had no answers. She arrived just after sunrise, finding only Father Way, kneeling beside the statue. Hannah said little. She unwrapped June, placed him on a small pillow before the statue of Mary, and dropped to her knees. She didn't pray with words. She wept, her lips moving silently, tears falling on the stone floor, hands trembling over a rosary she didn't know how to use. Father Way stood behind her, silent, offering no sermon, only presence. By evening, June's fever was gone. 2 days later, Hannah returned, her baby wide-eyed, pink-cheeked, cooing as if nothing had been wrong. The doctor at Mill Creek's clinic later admitted, off the record, that he had no explanation. The second story came from brothers Hiroshi and Kenji Tanaka, both in their 60s, who hadn't spoken in 22 years. A lawsuit over family land had torn them apart. They lived less than a mile apart but acted like strangers. Hiroshi arrived at the chapel midweek, unshaven, clutching an old Bible and a bouquet of sunflowers. He stared at the statue for nearly 20 minutes before kneeling. That evening, he walked to Kenji's door for the first time in decades. He didn't knock. He just stood there. Kenji opened the door, met his brother's eyes, and without a word, pulled him into a hug. When asked why, Hiroshi said only, "I heard her voice, make peace. The lady wants peace." The stories multiplied. A teenage girl with self-harm scars stopped visiting the emergency room. A man battling alcoholism for 15 years passed the chapel and felt something hold his chest until the craving faded. A 9-year-old boy who stuttered read a full page of scripture before the statue without pausing. Even skeptics softened. Sheriff Liang Zhou, who hadn't attended church since the 1990s, stood outside the chapel one evening, arms crossed, watching townsfolk file in. He didn't enter but stayed for hours. When asked why, he said, "I've never seen this town like this, and I'm not missing it." People no longer came just to look. They came to feel, to kneel, to cry, not out of desperation, but gratitude. They left notes beneath the statue, drawings, lockets, photos of lost loved ones. They whispered names of those they hadn't forgiven and then forgave them. It wasn't loud or viral, but it was real. Faith returned, not as a flash flood, but as a steady river finding its way back to the valley. The statue remained unmoved. Father Way refused to lift her back to her iron cradle. "She came down to be with us," he told anyone who asked. "Until she asks to be lifted, she stays." People began calling her the lady who fell but didn't break. Those who were there knew better, she didn't fall. She came down. And from wherever she came, she was bringing Coldwater Ridge back to life. The miracles continued, and so did the people. But Father Way couldn't stop thinking about her, the girl in white, Mei Lin, who sat silently in the third pew, touched the statue, and vanished like mist. While the town buzzed with wonder, while pilgrims lit candles and knelt with trembling hands, he was haunted by her eyes, dark, still, ancient yet young, as if she knew something the world had forgotten. At night, after the last parishioner left, Father Wei sat alone in the third pew, replaying that morning. What shoes had she worn? Had she spoken? How had she entered? How had she left? The next morning, he began asking questions. He called local schools, elementary, middle, daycare. No girl was missing. None matched his description. He shared a sketch, drawn by a churchgoer with a gift for portraits, black hair, gentle smile, white dress, wooden rosary. Still nothing. He searched parish records, baptism logs, Sunday school rosters, old confirmation photos. Every child from the past 30 years was accounted for. She wasn't among them. He visited neighboring towns, orphanages, group homes, shelters. He spoke to the county sheriff's night dispatcher. No runaways, no missing persons, no leads. She's not listed anywhere, he muttered one night in the church basement, flipping through faded rosters, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. But she was here. 2 weeks later, a woman arrived after the 6 p.m. Massachusetts. She was in her 80s, wrapped in a knitted shawl, silver hair tucked beneath a faded floral scarf. Her hands shook as she held a weathered envelope. "Are you Father Wei?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He nodded. "My name is Suyun Park. Folks call me Miss Sue. I think I know who the girl was." The envelope held a photo, bent at the corners, stained with age, its colors faded almost to sepia. In the photo was a little girl, no older than 10. Dark hair, white dress, wooden rosary. It was her. Father Wei Chen's breath caught. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Miss Suyun Park looked down at her shoes, then up with watery eyes. "She was my granddaughter," she said. Ami Park died 17 years ago, hit by a pickup truck just outside town on her way home from Sunday catechism. Silence fell heavy in the room. Father Wei sat slowly on the front pew, the photo trembling in his hand. "September 8th, Miss Sue continued. That was the day she passed. The same day she appeared here, wasn't it?" He nodded, throat too tight to speak. "She loved Mary," Miss Sue whispered. "Prayed to her every night, called her Mama Mary. Said when she died, she wanted Mary to hold her first." The priest's tears came unbidden. This wasn't just a ghost story or a vision. It was a child, once real, once alive, who had returned, not to haunt, but to guide, with grace. "People say they've dreamed of her," Miss Sue said, hands folded tightly. "They say she tells them not to be afraid, that the lady still listens." Father Wei looked up, voice low and shaking. "Do you believe it was her?" "I don't have proof, Father," she said, rising slowly. "But I have peace, more than I've had in 17 years. She handed him the photo and turned to leave. Before stepping into the cool mountain night, she added, "If she came back, it wasn't just for me. It was for all of us." That night, Father Wei framed the photo and placed it gently beside the fallen statue, just beneath Mary's open hands. No sign, no announcement, but those who came near felt it. This girl, this child of the hills, was part of the miracle. Even skeptics began to whisper her name, Ami. The dreams came quietly, like whispers, scattered and seemingly random. A nurse at the Coldwater Ridge Clinic spoke up first. Exhausted after a long shift, she'd fallen asleep on the breakroom couch. In her dream, a girl in white stood at the end of a hospital hallway, barefoot, hands folded in prayer. Her voice was soft as wind, clear as crystal. "She still hears you, even when you think she doesn't." The nurse wrote the words down, shaken. She didn't know who the girl was until a patient showed her a flyer with Ami's photo from the chapel. Her hands went cold. "It was her," she whispered. The second dream came from a 17-year-old boy, Kaingwin, quiet and withdrawn, who hadn't been to church since his father's funeral. One morning, his mother found him at the kitchen table, eyes wide, hands shaking, tears streaming. "She told me not to do it," he said. At first, she didn't understand. Then he pulled a crumpled suicide note from his hoodie pocket and burned it. He never shared the full dream, only that the girl took his hand, looked into his eyes, and said, "Tell Father Wei more are coming. Don't be afraid." Then came the children. A 6-year-old girl, Lila Chen, who couldn't yet read or write, walked into the chapel one afternoon, clutching a sheet of paper. On it was a crayon drawing, Mary floating downward in a beam of golden light, arms outstretched, and beside her, a girl in white holding hands with people of all ages, leading them to the church. When asked who taught her to draw it, Lila shrugged. "No one," she said. "She showed me." That same week, a Vietnam veteran from the town's outskirts came forward. He'd battled nightmares for decades. But that night, he dreamed of peace, silence without fear, light without judgment. "She didn't say anything," he told Father Wei, tears in his weathered eyes. "She stood by the statue, looking at me, and I knew I was forgiven." At first, Father Wei recorded each account in a small leather journal, unsure what else to do. The bishop offered no explanation. The press had moved on, but the dreams persisted, and the people kept coming. Some dreams were warnings, others comforts, but all carried a gentle urgency, a sacred tenderness. Ami never appeared as divine, not a saint in robes, just a child, glowing with something eternal. One night, Father Wei dreamed too. The chapel was empty, warm, golden, soft. Ami sat in the third pew, hands clasped, facing the altar. He didn't speak, neither did she. But when she turned to him, his heart broke and healed in the same moment. Her gaze held every dark thought he'd ever had, every moment he'd wanted to give up, every silent cry he'd never voiced. And she loved him anyway. When he woke, he wept, not from fear or joy, but from the overwhelming sense that he was not alone. The dreams wove the town together. Strangers shared stories over coffee in the chapel basement. Families brought journals filled with handwritten dreams. Teenagers came to confession unprompted. The air in Coldwater Ridge, once stale and heavy, shifted. The church's silence was no longer empty but filled with presence, as if the walls themselves listened, as if something unseen had taken residence. Someone who came not to amaze or terrify, but to awaken, to whisper in the darkness, "You are still loved, and it's not too late." Before all this, Our Lady of Grace was a forgotten relic. The white paint flaked like old snow, the bell tower leaned like a weary traveler. On most Sundays, only Father Wei's voice echoed off the wooden rafters, mingling with the scent of old wax, damp hymnals, and fading hope. But now, something had changed, not in a grand procession, no flashing lights or revival tents, no billboards on the highway. The change was quiet, like dew before dawn, but it was everywhere. It began with the doors. Once open for a handful, they now never stayed closed. From morning to night, people wandered in and out. Some came to kneel, some to cry, others to sit in the third pew where Mei Lin had been, breathing in the silence. Then came the sounds, not the hollow echoes of emptiness, but music. A young man, Jiro Sato, who hadn't touched a piano since his brother's funeral, asked to play during evening Massachusetts. He began with one hymn, then two. The congregation joined, their cracked voices and watery eyes filling the air with notes that felt alive. The confessional, once a storage closet, was cleaned out and reopened. Lines formed, people who hadn't confessed in 20 years stood quietly, holding nothing but stories, ready to surrender. On Wednesdays, the kitchen downstairs glowed again, not for fundraisers or committee meetings, but for something simpler: soup, bread, warmth. The church ladies, once the flower guild, now called themselves the table. They served hot meals to anyone who entered, no questions, no forms, just a plate and a seat. God doesn't ask your zip code before feeding you, one joked. By the third week, the statue of Mary remained on the ground. No one suggested returning her to the iron niche. There was power in seeing her at eye level, resting on folded linen, surrounded by candles and wildflowers from nearby meadows. She had come down, and now she was with them. Children sat near her, whispering to her, leaving drawings. One boy brought a toy soldier, his only one, to protect her, he said. The photo of Mei Lin, framed, sat beside the statue. No plaque, no name, no explanation, yet everyone knew. They called her the little guide, the one who brought them back, who whispered in dreams and held trembling hands. She became part of the church, not a legend, but a living presence, holy yet familiar, like a lantern in the fog. Father Weichen stopped preaching from the pulpit. He stepped down to the floor, among his people. His homilies became stories, not sermons. He spoke with them, not at them. Sometimes he cried, sometimes they did. The silence that followed felt sacred, not empty, as if God had spoken and needed no encore. People arrived from other towns, then counties. Some sought a miracle, but most came for something harder to name: peace, not from explanations, but from presence, from knowing heaven was closer than they thought. Even skeptics sat in the back pews, truck drivers, nurses, men who once scoffed at angels. They didn't all kneel or cross themselves, but they stayed longer than planned, hands shaking, eyes lingering. Something stirred, unnamed but undeniable. Coldwater Ridge became more than a dot on a map, a gathering place for the broken and hopeful, dreamers and doubters, those who'd lost faith and those who never had it but came anyway. Something had fallen but didn't break. Something had died but returned. And someone had whispered, "It's not over. Grace is still here." 3 weeks after the statue came down, Our Lady of Grace still lay on folded white linen, her gaze gently lifted, surrounded by candlelight and murmured prayers. No one moved her, no one suggested it. Deep down, they knew she hadn't fallen, she had descended. Father Wei never named the moment, apparition, miracle, or vision. He didn't need to. He told the truth. On a foggy September morning, during a nearly empty mass, a girl walked in, and Grace followed. In the quiet evening hours, after visitors left, he stood by the statue, the air thick with incense and memory. Sometimes he prayed, sometimes he was silent. Always, he felt he wasn't alone. One afternoon, he found a note tucked beneath the statue, in a child's handwriting. "Dear Mary, if you want, you can be my mom too. I don't have one here." Beside it, a pink plastic hair clip, likely from a backpack or playground, small, ordinary, holy. Word spread beyond Coldwater Ridge, to neighboring states. People arrived with folded maps, old grief, hesitant hope, bringing photos of lost children, medals of fallen soldiers, worn Bibles, wedding rings. They didn't seek answers but presents. Stepping inside, something shifted, a quiet nod of emptiness, but invitation. More than once, a visitor passing the third pew would stop, turn slowly, as if brushed by something, as if a child's gaze had met theirs. No one could prove anything, but no one needed to. Faith, true faith, doesn't demand proof, it asks to be received. One Sunday, a boy stood by the statue and said, "She came down because she didn't want to look at us from up there anymore." Father Way, listening nearby, smiled quietly. In those simple words, a mystery was named. The statue hadn't fallen, she had descended to walk among them, to kneel with the grieving, stand with the forgotten, hold a child's hand, and whisper, "I'm here." The chapel changed. The altar was no longer just a table but a meeting place between heaven and earth, sorrow and healing, spoken prayers and those too sacred to voice. Mei Lin was never seen again, but those who dreamed of her, wept with her, or heard her in the stillness didn't forget. Her photo remained beside Mary, and sometimes a daisy or crayon drawing appeared at its base, as if she were a saint, a sister, or both. The chapel bell no longer rang for ritual but to proclaim that grace had come down and stayed, not to dazzle, but to transform, to walk beside ordinary people in a forgotten church in a quiet valley. A statue once stood tall and chose to come close. Heaven doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it descends. And when it does, you don't need to understand, you only need to kneel.